Yo, this is me, Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus, and welcome to the Circus. And here we continue with this new format I'm going with, where I talk about something I like. So, first thing to point out, I am a huge fan of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Like, seriously. So, I grew up, I was born in the 90s, I grew up, late 90s, early mid-2000s. So for me, it was the 2003 series. I watched that whole series. I watched, VHS tapes from the library and from some family members of the original 80s series when I was growing up. I watched the 2012 series when it came out. I watched Rise. Anybody who disparages Rise will get a swift kick in the butt from me, because Rise was awesome and it was canceled, and it's the shortest running Ninja Turtle show, and that is a damn crime. I don't know when Nick is supposedly releasing its movie, which will be the proper finale for the series, but I want it now. Also, there's the freaking Seth Rogen produced movie that's coming out whenever. I've seen all the movies. I don't hate the Bay produced ones. I don't think they're that bad, honestly. You could say whatever you want. They're not great, but they're not terrible, as far as I'm concerned. Let's see. And, of course, I had some action figures growing up. Sadly, I don't have those anymore because I lost them, because, like so many of us, I failed to realize their value. One of my closest friends, who's about a decade older than me, was born right before the 80s series started, more or less, give or take something like a year, and as such, he was like 2, grew up on that show, and like me, had some figures that he no longer has, because we're all idiots who somehow fail to realize the value of the things we have from our childhood. But anyway, let me just tell you what I'm going to be doing with this particular series going forward, outside of all the other stuff I'm going to be examining going forward on the channel, is I'm going to be going over the original run of Eastman and Lair Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And as that particular production team changes on that comic, going over that too. Essentially, I'll be going over the original 1984 to 1993 run, which is volume 1 for those of you who don't know. So, when it comes to the Ninja Turtles comics, the original ones, there's the original, 1984 to 1993 run, that's volume 1. And it's the longest run by far, with over 60 issues. The other 3 volumes each have different numbers, and all of them are veritably smaller. I actually think volume 2, I don't remember exactly how many issues volume 2 has, but I know volume 2 is like the shortest volume by far. Now, we're going to try and go in chronological order, and that includes all of the, let's just say, side comics that were released. For instance, Casey Jones was first introduced in a micro issue, which was a 4 series that each focused on one of the 4 turtles. And of course, Casey was introduced in the one in which focused on Raph. So we'll be going over those as we hit them. But right now, we're of course going on Eastman and Lair's original Ninja Turtles #1, which, for your information, was never meant to be a #1. It was just meant to be a one-off issue of a silly parody idea that Eastman and Lair came up with to kind of make fun of what was popular back then in the early to mid-80s. And specifically the ninja craze, and of course all of Frank Miller's works at the time, such as Ronin, and of course the Daredevil run and stuff like that. And as such, we'll be going over the first issue. I've a lot more notes than I have from last week, a lot of notes. Let me see here, something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4.5 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4.5 notes, my God. Yeah, it took me a while. It took me a while just to look over the comic, and I've read the first few. In fact, I remember exactly where I cut off. For those of you who are familiar with the Ninja Turtles mythos, the classic storyline of them getting attacked by the Shredder and then having to leave New York and going out to a farmhouse, which I will point out, the farmhouse changes. It changes who owns the farmhouse in a given continuity. I don't I stopped right before they got to the big storyline focusing on the events at the farmhouse. Like, so right after they got their butts kicked by Shredder in New York in April's place. So I don't know who in the original continuity. I will once I read that part, once we get there. But I don't know who owns the farmhouse in the comics specifically, but in the 1990s movie, it was April's. In the 2000 series, it was Casey's, and then in the 2012 series, it was once again April's. So it's kind of, up in the air who exactly owns the farmhouse in the original comics. I know that's such a minute thing, but that's why I'm like, and hell, that's basically almost the entirety of the notes I've made, which, look at this stuff. Look at it. It's crazy. But anyway, let's actually get into it and start talking about the issue itself. Otherwise, I'll go blathering on. Also, I just want to point out, I initially considered starting with issue number 2 and redirecting people to Linkara's review of Ninja Turtles number 1. My reasoning being that he was, I felt a little bit more qualified to actually talk about it, but this isn't technically a review, or at least it's not only a review, and as such, I don't think it would make sense. I will say I will leave a link to his review of this comic in the description. Also, I am surprised, genuinely. Like, he's spoken about how he was not the biggest Ninja Turtles fan, and so it makes sense he hasn't reviewed too much of that stuff. But I am genuinely surprised only one person has ever paid him to review a Ninja Turtles comic, because there's so many. Not just talking the main continuity stuff or the spin-offs based on all the different shows and movies, or let's say The Last Ronin, which I have bought each and every issue that has come out. Issue 4 is coming out this month, so I'm going to buy it when it comes out. And of course, I'll probably review those eventually. Whether you guys want me to review The Last Ronin once I have the entire series, because I haven't actually read any of the issues yet. I'm waiting until I have the whole series. But if you want me to review it when I have it completed, or you want me to wait to talk about it until after I've gotten to that point in the timeline, which would be a while considering how many comics there are between this and when those events would have happened. But regardless, I will get there. Interesting thing too, once we get to past volume 2, volumes 3 and 4 are sort of a split in the timeline. They're kind of like what could have happened going forward, or what could have happened going forward. So, sort of a split in the original Turtles Prime Universe timeline. But anyway, we'll get there when we get there. So let's actually start talking about this, otherwise we'll be here forever. I just want to, so let's start by saying that...
My name is Leonardo, and right now my brothers and I are in a mess of trouble. Our backs are up against the wall in some trash-strewn alley, cornered by the toughest street gang on the east side.
Look at the freaks! What's with the dweeby costume?
This ain't Halloween.
You're going down, freaks!
Yeah!
Nobody messes with the purple dragons, especially wearing stupid turtle costumes.
He's wrong. We're not wearing costumes.
Coincidence? I think not!
And that makes sense, because they adapted a lot of the stories from the comics pretty accurately in that show. Not all the time. They changed some stuff here and there, but it was pretty accurate. And they used the exact dialogue of Leo narrating over the events. And it's great. Right down to finishing up with, he's wrong. We're not wearing costumes. And that's great. I just love that. Also, I want to talk about the Purple Dragons, because the Purple Dragons are interesting because they've shown up in a lot of different Turtles continuities. I don't think they ever showed up in the 80s show. That's the one I haven't rewatched in a while and have probably the least forward knowledge of, because it was such an episodic show compared to all the others. But I don't think they ever really used the Purple Dragons in the 80s show. If I'm wrong, somebody please tell me. In the 2003 series, they were kind of, I don't know, they were kind of a permanent, thing. They kind of stuck around a lot in the 2003 series, the Purple Dragons. In the 2012 series, they didn't show up for a while, but they were interesting, and they were changed, there weren't too many of them, but it was interesting, and then finally, when it came to the Rise, they did something. They made the Purple Dragons very different, and they actually made them connected to Donnie specifically as a sort of group of arch nemesis for him. They became a group of tech criminals and hackers, and I like that change. One, it connects them directly to Donnie, both with the color purple and just with the tech stuff, but it's a nice, change of pace. And that was one of the things I liked about Rise. They did a lot of interesting, different stuff. But let's see. My next note is about Raph specifically, and it's kind of interesting, as one of the points that Linkar brought up in his review of this issue is how there is not a lot of characterization for most of the turtles except maybe Raph, and this bit from Leo's narration also like points that out. And I'm going to read this as it was like, this is like Leo kind of narrating and monologuing in his own head about what's going on, and he describes it. And so he's talking about each of his brothers, and he specifically goes into real detail when it comes to Raph. I sense his body quivering with tense energy, waiting to be triggered into savage slashing release. Now that's very interesting. Because it's like it's really the best description of any of the turtles that we get throughout the whole book, and we get a little bit more with Raph going forward in the issue. But it's interesting to see that he seems the one who gets the most characterization throughout, not really compared to, say, any of the others. And I will point out stuff like that going forward, but that is something I noticed, and it's interesting to consider, considering it's weird that it would be Raph of all turtles. I mean, it might be weirder if it was, say, Donnie, who is probably the turtle who gets the least focus, in my opinion, when it comes to every individual part of the franchise. At least in my opinion. Donnie's useful. He's a utilities guy, but I don't feel like he gets a lot of focus in a lot of the series, if you know what I mean. Although, going back to Rise again, Rise Donnie is the funniest version of Donatello ever, and might be my favorite version of Donnie, period. But anyway, also, this is also just something I wanted to point out, that this is the continuity where all of the Turtles' headbands are red. And that might not sound like a big deal, but obviously it's important, especially going forward, because I do have another note that relates to that to a certain extent. But in essence, it's important because it shows how the turtles weren't, because this was meant to be a one shot, so the turtles aren't distinguished a lot, which makes sense why the characterization isn't really there. It wasn't meant to be an ongoing series, but it became stupidly popular, and Eastman and Lair, they knew what they had, so they went with it. And then I have another quote from Leo about Raph, and it's like, Raphael loves this stuff. His size flash as he leaps. So it's like, yeah, they I don't know what it is, but Leo's narration about Raph is a little bit more intense than it is about, say, Donnie or Mikey. And isn't it interesting, thinking about the nicknames of the turtles, Leo for Leonardo makes sense. Donnie for Donatello makes sense. And, Mikey from Michelangelo is a little odd, but then again, how many guys are actually named Michelangelo nowadays? Probably more than I'd assume. I'm named Michael, so what do I know? But I always find it interesting to think about Raph, because it's how many Raphaels were there before this book was written? I don't think there were that many in the modern times, and calling them Raph as a nickname is... And it happens in this comic, so it's weird to think about, but that's an actual thing, and the Turtles may have come up with it. I don't know, I could be wrong, but I assume they might have. And then we get to, this bit. This was just something I had to point out, but with this particular panel of showing New York, after Leo finishes his initial monologue with the classic line, and we fade away into the night. And there's just a picture, a panel of New York, and it's just empty. And I'm like, I don't know if you've ever been to New York City, especially at night. Well, maybe not especially, but just at any time. It doesn't matter, day or night. It's the reason it's called the city that never sleeps. It's because literally there's always people out and about. The city itself is always bright, loud, smelly. There are always people moving here or there. You gotta, it's obviously less busy at night, but you're never unlikely, there's always gonna be somebody on the streets at night in New York City. So this panel was just, I've been to New York, and I live in New York State. I live on Long Island specifically. I've been to New York a million times. I could tell you right now, New York City is never empty like this. It's frankly, if New York was ever this empty, that is might be one of the scariest things I've ever seen. And I've seen this happen before in other depictions. It's obviously why they didn't draw too many anybody walk in the streets. It's because that's they drew this themselves. I can't blame them for not putting in that, because it would have taken a little too much effort based on the work. It would have taken a lot of work, and it seemed unnecessary at the time. It's not a big deal. It's just something I noticed. Also, and this is something I noticed too, and I kept track of this as I read the comic, and this is my next note. There are quotation marks around the narration in all the narration boxes, but not around the dialogue. Now, obviously, I don't think you would put the quotation marks around the dialogue and the dialogue balloons, but I don't think I've really seen quotation marks around narration in comics before either. And granted, I don't read comics as often as I want to, but I'm 80% positive that quotation marks around the narration is a weird thing. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I might check this because I read comics, mostly Spider-Man comics outside of Ninja Turtles or Star Wars stuff. I read comics, but the point is, I don't remember this being a thing. So is this just a thing here? Is this something that Eastman and Lair did? I'll have to keep track of it as I go through the issues. But if anybody wants to tell me if this is a thing that actually exists in comics on a regular basis, I'd be more than happy to hear it, because I have no idea why there are quotation marks around the narration. Finally, okay, next note. We finally get, the turtles have escaped into the sewer after kicking the purple dragon's butts, and I want to point out, I want to point this out real quick, going back to that fight with the purple dragons. It doesn't come across like the turtles ever actually killed any of them. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is a bloody comic. It's a graphic, violent, black and white, gritty, indie comic. It was indie at the time. I don't know if you can call an indie comic, any comic for the Ninja Turtles now, an indie comic. But the fact of the matter is, it's never, at least with the way it's drawn, it's never entirely clear if they just beat them up or cut them up and, knock them out, or actually kill any of the purple dragons. And that's important as far as I'm concerned, because, I refuse to call it a kill unless it's confirmed. Granted, there is a part where it looks like Leo really cuts a guy, so that guy might bleed out, but whatever. Anyway, going back, they escape into the sewers, into the storm drains, and they get back to the lair. And isn't it interesting that the turtles' home is always called the Lair for some reason? Why is that? That seems like such a ubiquitous term, but it's in every iteration where they talk about the way they call it that. I just find that funny. But anyway, they get back to the lair, and there's a brick wall that splits apart and reveals their home, where they live, where there's Master Splinter. They got some bookshelves. It's not shown in this issue, but there's a TV, going forward, there's a TV in the lair. And I assume they have a fridge. I don't think I remember seeing a fridge, but to be fair, we see very little of the lair this issue. The point is, they have a secret wall mechanism, a brick wall mechanism that moves and splits the wall in two. Now, obviously, that's there so that just in case there's somebody down there, I don't know, a sewer maintenance worker or something, or a sanitation worker, they can't find their home. But I wonder, obviously this wasn't established yet. This was just something that Eastman and Lair decided to put in the first issue just because, and it makes sense. But in hindsight, I assume this is something that Donnie built. The mechanism to open up the wall, that's got to be a Donnie thing, right? By the way, just out of curiosity, how do you spell Donnie? Because I always call Donatello Donnie, and when I spell it D-O-N-N-I-E. But I know some people spell it D-O-N-Y or D-O-N-N-Y. And so, it's weird. It's of all the people with nicknames, you can also call him Don. So it's weird, how Donatello has multiple ways you can call him a nickname. Whereas, you call Michelangelo Mike or Mikey, but I don't remember people calling him Mike too often. So it's mostly Mikey. But I feel anyway, how do you spell Donatello or Donnie specifically? Tell me down in the comments if you feel so inclined. But anyway, Anyway, like, I assume Donnie was the one who built the mechanism into the walls to hide their home. I mean, it makes sense. And like I said, this wasn't intended at the time, but it makes sense in hindsight that it was probably Donnie who built it. Anyway, then there's a panel of Splinter talking, and it's beginning, he's like complimenting them, and he's about to tell the story that he hasn't explained their backstory to them just yet. So he's about to do so. And I noted all of the books on their bookshelves, and it took me a little bit, thankfully the Turtles wiki actually helped me figure out 2 of the names of the books that I couldn't figure out. And as such, I know most of the books that are on display. But let me just read you, because some of these are actual books. So, the first book was very hard to read, but once I found out what it was and I looked at the actual drawing again, you can actually tell. If you know what it is, you can tell what it is. So, because I read it as the Book of Fine Ra, something with an R, but it's actually the Book of 5 Rings, and it's a book written by one Miyamoto Musashi in the mid-17th century Japan, and he's like a legendary Japanese swordsman, and he basically explains the rules of combat and how to use both in individual duels and in larger battles. He was big on it, and he was a very no nonsense kind of guy, because I did some research, and apparently there's parts where he talks about, when it comes to swordsmanship, extra flourishes when it comes to using your forms in swordsmanship are 100% unnecessary. They're excessive, as he put it, and therefore so that's an interesting, it makes sense that they have it, and it's interesting because there is a section about fighting with 2 swords, which obviously is Leo's specialty, so I find that interesting. The next book was a Jansen's art history, which I actually, funnily enough, I never bothered to check if that one was an actual book. So you know what? If it's a real book, I'll put that up here on screen and maybe a picture of a copy, because I obviously don't have one, if it does exist. I assume it does, because Eastman and Laird were, comic book nerds. They loved comics. They were big fans of Jack Kirby, and they obviously went in and drew their own stuff and became comic book artists and drew the Turtles and yada, yada, yada. But if they I wouldn't be surprised if Jansen's art history was an actual book that one of them happened to own and decided to just put in there as a placeholder, because they wrote all the other names. Then the next book is Pow of Jeet Kune Do, which is a book that was written by Bruce Lee. Well, it wasn't even a book. It was more of a memoir sort of thing he was writing, and then he died, and it was published by his wife post his death. But it was sort of Bruce Lee's perception on, how do I put this? His perception on the martial arts and his philosophy when it comes to the martial arts. It's not really a how-to guide when it comes to martial arts, but more of just his thoughts on the subject and his, feelings on it. And he sadly never got to finish it or publish it or see it published. It was only published after his death, but, it's cool to see that that the Turtles and Splinter own a copy of that, because it makes sense. That's another cool addition to their library, apparently. Then, and this is a fun one, because this is clearly just something, at least I assume this is something that Eastman and Laird made up, and I assume this is a book that Splinter used in raising the Turtles, because it says Care and Keeping of Your Turtle, which sounds basically like a pet owner's guide to taking care of a turtle, which I'm sure is still applicable to a certain extent, but how applicable it is to 4 mutant turtle children is really hard to say. I mean, really, I would love to get a series that is just focused on Splinter raising the Turtles after, everything between the beginning of, where the story usually starts and when the Turtles are first mutated, I would love to see that part. Just give me a series just about, Splinter raising the Turtles. That would be fantastic. Give me that. That would be beautiful. I don't, it would be insane. It'd probably be pretty mundane by the standards. They could add some action here and there. Maybe, obviously, they'd have to put the training stuff, actually having Splinter train the Turtles in there. But, really the early stuff, obviously, because we do occasionally see Splinter training the Turtles, just not from the beginning. And so I'd like to see that, because that would be cool. Then there's a book that's just called The Ninja, which sounds less like an instructional guide about being a ninja and more like a pulp novel or a trashy B novel, about a ninja, maybe like a romance book, kind of like if for those of you who are familiar with this, Ninjas of Love, that's what it kind of popped into my head when I saw this, but it's there. And then there's just a book called The Complete, and then the rest of the title is kind of cut off the way it's drawn, but that's what it says. So if somebody wants to tell me in the comments, even though I'll confirm this while I'm editing this and put it up, but if somebody wants to tell me whether or not Jansen's art history is, an actual book, I would appreciate it. But yeah, I just found that interesting, and so I felt compelled to, I felt compelled to write down the books and try and figure out which ones that weren't entirely clear, because if you look just at the panel, I mean, if I had a physical issue, because I'm reading the comic, oh my god, excuse me, for that was rude, I guess, I don't know, but yeah, but anyway, I'm reading the comic online through scans of the Turtles. And as such, if I was reading through a physical copy of the comic, I'm not sure I would be able to read what the book titles are, but regardless, it's interesting to consider. But going into it, I also want to point out, we get to the backstory bit with Splinter talking about the past, and frankly, I just had to bring this up, but Splinter is a rat in this continuity, and he's a rat every third time in the continuity, although at this point I feel like he's almost more human more times than not. I've always preferred Splinter being a rat first and being mutated into a biped. I don't know why I think in the original animated series they did that so that they wouldn't have to explain all the murders that take place in the backstory, and all the fact that it sort of streamlines having Hamato Yoshi and Splinter be the same person. But I've always preferred it where Splinter is the rat, the pet rat of Yoshi. But I know some people disagree with me on that. I've never had any trouble, and just the idea of Splinter mimicking Yoshi from his cage, and I like that idea. And there's a great panel of that. See this panel? This is one of my favorites because it shows the two of them, and it shows Splinter actually mimicking Yoshi. But anyway, then we get into the backstory a bit more, and we find out about, Hamato Yoshi, Tang Shen, Oroku Saki. Oroku Saki doesn't appear immediately in the backstory, but he shows up eventually, obviously. And then we have Oroku Nagi, and Oroku Nagi is interesting because I don't think Oroku Nagi has ever featured in any version of the Turtles' backstory except for the original here. I could be wrong. If anybody wants to tell me if there's another version of Nagi out there in the Turtles continuity, please. There's Oroku Nagi. So, for those of you who don't know, Nagi is Saki's older brother. And if you've ever seen the 1990 movie, which is probably the closest to what happened, how the backstory is described here, and really a lot of the events from the movie are very closely tied to certain parts of the comics. But if you look at Nagi's situation, he is essentially in Saki's place here, as he usually is, especially, again, like I said, if you look at the movie, where he's the one who's also in love with Tang Shen, and he's Yoshi's rival, and it's interesting. For whatever reason, I guess, again, probably for the same reason that Splinter's usually turned into the same person as Yoshi, they, sort of streamline it by having Nagi be, be removed from it and just have it be Saki from the beginning. It kind of simplifies it, and I mean it from not just from a storytelling perspective, it simplifies it, but it also kind of morally simplifies it. And I'll get into that in a second. But yeah, when you get down to it, it's very different. And then you get to the part about the Foot Clan, and how the Foot Clan, of course, were just this ancient clan of ninjas and assassins that lived in Japan and were the best. And Yoshi was a part of that. And it's interesting to look back at that and really, because that's part that usually it ties into it, whether or not Yoshi. You know what? I might make a video about this in the future, just, the minute differences they make to be in the individual Turtles and Splinters backstory in relation to the Foot, the Shredder, Saki, yada yada, maybe if Tang Shen is even there or not, you know, stuff like that. I might make a video about that in the future. But regardless, let's move forward. And then, of course, to borrow a joke from Linkara, because I can't help myself.
Meanwhile, in Japan, Nagi's family, especially his younger brother Saki, were mourning his death. The 7-year-old Saki vowed vengeance on Yoshi. The Foot took hold of Saki's anger and used it to bend him to their own purposes. Saki began intensive training in the ninja's art and soon surpassed his teachers. As he grew older, his hatred of Yoshi grew deep and bitter.
How did you know about the parts you weren't there for?
This is probably not a continuity thing, because something like this, there's a continuity snag that comes up later in the comic that I'm going to bring up, but it's like from, there's this bit where we have 3 panels. Here they are. I'll show them on screen. We have Saki training intensely for 11 years to become the badass shredder that he will be in the future. So we have him as a child. I presume, once he starts training at 7 to, go into it after he becomes, obsessed with avenging his brother's death. You would have him in his teenage years, I presume, and then him more or less an adult, even though, at the tail end of his teenage years, because that's when he gets promoted. Maybe the middle one is his preteen years, I don't know. But he, it looks like he's, proceeding from child to teenager to adult. That's what the images make me think of, at least. But well, he's promoted and given command of his own branch of the Foot Clan in New York when he's 18, which is 11 years he trained to avenge his brother. Now, what I find interesting about this, for some reason in the middle panel he's bald. I guess he shaved his head somewhere in there, and I'm like, you decided to shave your head for some reason, Shredder? Saki? Why? I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, I love the Turtles and I love Eastman and Lair, and I'm like, but, I mean, was this a conscious decision on your guys' part, or did you just decide for some reason? I mean, him wearing the sweatband makes sense when he's bald because he's got no hair to catch all the sweat, and considering how physically fit he is, yeah, he'd be sweating a lot, so wearing the headband while he's bald makes sense, which means that it makes it feel like it's a conscious decision. But then it's like, why? You're implying that Oroku Saki, the Shredder, decided to shave his head in the middle of his teenage years while training to avenge his brother. I just felt the need to bring this up. What? Why did he shave his head? I know I'm making such a big deal out of this because I don't get it. It's so random. If he did it when he was younger, or maybe but in the middle, it's in the middle. That's why it throws me so much. It's like he had hair, he shaved it for a bit, and then he grew it back. I did that too, but I did it I did that twice in my life. I did it, the first time was for charity, the second time was on a whim. So maybe he did it on a whim, but it's like, I don't know, that seems so out of place. But anyway, then we have what I like to call the Foot Shadow Council. Just, I guess, this shadowy leadership of the Foot Clan that apparently exists. Because in most continuities, the Shredder is the sole leader of the Foot. How he becomes the sole leader of the Foot is kind of different. Like in the original animated series, the Foot were originally not that bad, and Yoshi was a member, but he was thrown out because it actually surprises me they got away with this in the original animated series, but Saki made it look like Yoshi was going to eliminate or assassinate the leader of the Foot Clan, and I'm like, okay, so they got away with that in 1987 on a show for children. I mean, granted, they didn't show anything too graphic, but that's what it's implied, so it's just hilarious. And what's funny is they just kick him. They don't even really, all they do is exile Yoshi. I mean, it's bad because he ends up living on the streets in New York and then gets mutated into a rat, but he still only gets exiled instead of, I don't know, tried and convicted and executed for attempted murder? I don't know. Wait, is the death penalty, I mean, I know the death penalty is a bit of a touchy subject, but is the death penalty applied when it's just attempted murder? My head hurts. You know what? Never mind. The point is, this is weird. But again, like I said, so in the comics, there's a council of leaders when it comes to the Foot Clan, and there are many branches that they're trying to expand throughout the world. And so it's not just the Shredder. Whereas something like the 2003 series, and of course, like the 90s movies, it's the Shredder all the way who's the leader. 2012, it's again, like, you know, the Foot Clan is still ancient, but the Shredder kind of inherited the mantle of leadership there. It depends on the continuity. That's another weird thing that's changed depending on the continuity. I mean, granted, I don't think, outside of maybe the 80s series, I don't think there's ever really been a reference to someone outside of the Shredder leading the Foot in one way or another. It's just weird, because there's this shadowy council, and I know this is very much a case of early installment weirdness when it comes to this. It's just, I don't know, it's another thing that I found really interesting, and I felt the need to jot it down. Then there's Saki, and then of course they mention how, and this is something else I wanted to bring up, like, it mentions how, you know, within a year, Saki, or the Shredder, like, begins to spread the Foot's influence throughout the city, and they start doing more criminal activities like drug smuggling and arms running, and I'm like, and of course their specialty is assassination, and assassination had been mentioned earlier, and that makes sense for ninjas. I'm wondering, in Japan, were the Foot already a criminal organization, or was that just Saki / the Shredder's influence that made them a criminal organization in the city? I'm just curious about that, because it's like, okay, I don't know. It stood out to me as a little bizarre, or at least eyebrow raising. Like, okay, were they always criminals, or is that just a new thing? I don't even know. Okay, then there's this, and this is something that I think we really need to look over in much detail. How old is Splinter, really? Because, I don't know if you're aware of this, but rats don't exactly live for very long. Rats, on average, in the wild, live less than a year. And in captivity, while the ability to care for a rat and take care of a rat's health has continued to the point where a rat can live maybe 4+ years, it's generally still not, like, the average lifespan for a rat these days is still only like 3 to 4 years. In the 80s, it would have been shorter and closer to like 3 years maximum, with a more likelihood of 2. So how old is Splinter? Because let's take a few things into account. When Saki is crying over his brother's casket, and after Nagi's murdered, Saki is described in the narration by Splinter as being 7 at the time. 7. Okay. And he's 18 when he's given command of the New York branch of the Foot. Okay. That's 11 years. Now, assuming that we don't know how long Yoshi had Splinter before he killed Nagi, but let's take this into account. If Splinter was at maximum, let's say 2 years when Nagi was killed, and then him, Shen, and Yoshi went to New York, and then 11 years passed, that would mean Splinter is about 13 as a rat, just a normal rat. This is pre being exposed to the ooze. He is just a rat. I want to point this, or at least he appears to just be a rat, but then you take into account that the Guinness World Record for the longest life of a rat, which is a thing, is 7 years and 4 months. Now, someone bothered to jot this down, and this rat even lived around the same period of this comic and the beginning of the Turtles franchise, because this rat was born in 1983 and died in 1990. So the year before this comic was published, and then the year that the first movie came out. But this rat lived for 7 years and 4 months. If Splinter was 13 when Shen and Yoshi were murdered by the Shredder, that means that Splinter is almost twice as old as the oldest recorded living rat in human history, at least as far as we're concerned. That's a weird thing to say, but it's true. Now, I've never had any trouble suspending my disbelief about Splinter being able to mimic Yoshi's movements from his cage. I've always thought that was a cool detail, that he was such an intelligent rat that he could do that. It's cool, you know? But taking that into account, and the fact that he lived this long before even being exposed to the ooze, what the frack? I'm genuinely a little confused, because, like, there's no way Splinter, I don't know, maybe I'll write a fan fiction about this, or someone has some fan theories. Splinter cannot be a normal rat. He can't be, because it's like, how the heck are you able, like, if you take into account both the ability to mimic and somehow learn ninjutsu from mimicking his master in his cage, and then be living that long pre-exposure to the ooze, Splinter is not a normal rat, and I just don't know. This is weird. This is weird. So, now keep in mind, I don't know how old, but let's say even that Splinter was just born, or at least a little less than a year old when everything with Nagi happened and they fled to New York. Even taking my initial 2 years out of the equation, that means he would be something like, again, at least 11 years old for a rat. That's still ridiculously long. It's so weird. I know I'm focusing on this. I'm going to move on. I might look into this. I might write a fan fiction explanation for this, but it's just Splinter being that old. I want to make this a thing. We need to make this a thing, people. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on. Otherwise, this is going to be home. I might make a video about this. I don't know. I might write a fan fiction. I don't know. Moving on. We're in the middle of the backstory where Splinter's explaining the mutation and everything, and he specifically refers to the ooze as ooze, but the way he says it, and I wrote it down like a bit of how he phrases it, a glowing green ooze, a glowing green ooze, and the word ooze is emphasized in the text, which is probably why it stands out so much, but outside of that, it's described as a ooze, as in it's not specifically called the ooze, it's a ooze, which is a very weird minor detail, because eventually, I mean, granted, nowadays I feel like we mostly refer to the stuff as mutagen. Ooze, of course, gets referenced here and there, but it's weird. Like, it's not really called, but it's so weird because it's such a minor detail and it became such a big part of the mythos. I mean, specifically what the substance that the Turtles and Splinter and a couple of other mutants were hit with that mutated them, you know, what it's called, which makes sense, but still. But anyway, like, then there's a bit about, like, the Turtles' growth from Splinter, and it's like, within a year, you had reached your current size. And then I write, how tall are the Turtles? Because the Turtles are shown to be small, like short specifically, in most depictions. Like, there's been some exceptions in the recent years. The Bay movies, in the 2012 animated series, the Turtles all have very different heights to distinguish them from each other, and with Donnie being really tall. But traditionally, in the original comics, in the original cartoon, even in the 1990 movie, they're all kind of short, you know? Like, and I feel like that makes sense. They're not gonna, I don't think the mutation would make them that tall, but again, it's up to interpretation anyway. Point is, they're kind of short, and yet Splinter says they reached their current size within a year, which means that in the comics, the Turtles didn't go through a necessarily natural growth cycle. Eventually they stood upright and they started talking and yada yada. But in essence, they were fully grown within a year, which, if you think about it, makes sense because they are turtles and animals tend to grow faster than humans do. It's just weird to think about. And then Splinter, who, if he, being as old as he would have already been an adult, and therefore the fact, like, apparently, like, Splinter apparently didn't grow as quickly as the Turtles, which raises some really weird questions there, because, like I said, Splinter was fully grown. Like, there's no doubt about that. You can say what you want about how weird his age is, but he would have been fully grown. So it's weird. Also, it occurred to me that Splinter, being as old as he is, it's no wonder he's always depicted as elderly, as a rat, because as a rat, he was already at the tail end of his life. No wonder he's old, basically an old man by the time he's mutated into a biped. It makes a weird sort of sense. But anyway, yeah, so, and Splinter is usually shorter than the Turtles, so the fact that, like, I've always considered the Turtles are probably somewhere, like, 4'10". That's my, or at least for the four of them in their, like, original incarnations, they're pretty short. Because they're even shorter than April. In, like, once we meet her, like, they're shorter than she is, so, yeah. And then Splinter is shorter than them, and I'd say he's about, like, 3 feet if I were willing to put money on it. I just found, like, a little weird. But anyway, here's some, then next bit we're going to get into is a bit of headcanon. So, Splinter was shocked when they first spoke, and they spoke English, which is interesting. It kind of almost implies that, and granted, it makes sense. Why would Splinter try and talk if he didn't think he could, or just he didn't really have anybody to talk to? So it kind of, the way it's written, it implies almost that the Turtles talked before Splinter did, but it's also entirely possible that Splinter just didn't expect them to be able to talk, and maybe they learned to talk from, if not Splinter, maybe they already had a TV, maybe Splinter found an old TV for them to use, or maybe, like, I don't know, maybe Splinter, like, maybe they, like, go, like, on expeditions to the surface occasionally, they hide out to practice their stealth skills, and maybe that's how they learn to talk. I don't know, because to learn to properly speak, a person needs to be exposed to other people talking, and that's how you learn languages, by registering what the words mean, and therefore being able to use it. Speaking of which, I'd be willing to bet that Splinter, because he's been exposed to both Japan and New York, I'd be willing to bet Splinter speaks both fluent Japanese and English. And he's usually depicted with a Japanese accent, which, you know, kind of makes sense, especially since he was mostly around Shen and Yoshi, and so he probably got the accent from listening to Yoshi speak. But he also would probably, like, assuming that they, like, Yoshi and Shen both changed when they spoke certain languages, it would make sense if Splinter was at least bilingual, and maybe the Turtles, too, by extension, were taught how to speak multiple languages. But anyway, and then there's a bit where, like, they're talking about, you know, Splinter's describing training the Turtles, and he specifically describes, he says, empty hand fighting, which I assume is how Eastman and Lair decided to describe, you know, hand-to-hand combat. And I'm just like, was the term hand-to-hand combat not a commonly known thing in the mid-'80s? Because it's a really weird way of describing, you know, fighting without weapons. You know, like, and that felt weird to do. But point is, it's just such a empty hands fighting. I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that in the future because that is, like, such a weird way of putting it. All right, now let's get to this part because this is important. This is about Splinter's morality and how, despite the being drawn in black and white, how morally gray the situation is in this first comic and with the Turtles' backstories in general. So, just to put this down, what we have, the basic backstory of the Turtles is this. Discounting the mutation and being turtles and a rat, let's get this down, shall we? So, 2 guys are in love with a woman. She chooses one of them. And then the one guy decides to murder her because she refused to be with him. Other guy walks in, sees his girl being beaten down by his rival, goes into a rage, and then beats the guy to death. Now, obviously, Yoshi felt bad for that, whatever, that's fine. Then he goes to New York. Then the younger brother of the guy who was killed trains for over a decade, and then comes and murders the man who killed his brother and the wife. And then, 15 years after that, and then Splinter, who was Yoshi's pet, who loved his master and his master's wife very much, has raised these 4 mutant turtles as his sons and trained them in the art of ninjutsu, sends them out to kill Shredder, aka Oroku Saki. So you see, and obviously, like, there's kind of a moral grayness to all this because we have to look at this from a standpoint. Like, Splinter specifically is sending the turtles not just to stop. The Shredder is a criminal, yes. He's like a kind of a crime boss, but he's not doing anything like clearly, like not obviously morally reprehensible. At least, I mean, outside of the obvious stuff of being a crime boss and doing all these things I mentioned earlier, like drug smuggling and arms dealing, but whatever. The point is, Splinter's not sending the turtles out to stop Shredder because Shredder is a bad dude, which the Shredder is, no doubt about that. He's sending them out to kill Shredder. Now, maybe call this early installment weirdness, call it whatever you want, and it's not like these comics get any less violent going forward, but this is probably the most morally ambiguous, I guess. Like, the turtles are very clearly painted as the good guys going forwards in the comics, at least as far as I remember. Even with all the violence and the possible killing, but this is probably the most morally ambiguous thing, even with, and it's clear, I think this is very clear, and once we get to the fight between the turtles and the Shredder, this will become even more clear. Now, let's look at this at from a case-to-case basis, shall we? Like, so going back to the killing of Nagi, what happened exactly? Okay, well, Shen was essentially wooed by both guys. And for lack of a better way to put it, Yoshi won. And Shen chose Yoshi. That is as far as we know, not up for debate. Time goes by, and Nagi, not being able to deal with this, decides to like try and force Shen to love him. She refuses. He beats her down. Yoshi comes in, and in a blind rage, beats Nagi to death, to the point where his fists are covered in the man's blood. That being the case, what does he do? He could either kill himself or travel to a different country in exile with his wife and pet rat. He chooses the latter. Okay. Then, a decade later, the Shredder, Saki decides to, after having been appointed, given his own branch of the Foot to lead in New York, travels there, goes to Shen and Yoshi's home and kills them both. Then Splinter, as in what is for all intents and purposes is a normal rat at this point, lives on the streets, gets mutated, and then decides after caring for these turtles. And it's clear, I think, Splinter does care about the turtles. Like, he clearly, treats them with respect. He loves them. But he has essentially trained them all this time to kill a man. And so he is literally sending them on a mission to kill Oroku Saki. That is not up for debate in any capacity. Now, if you look at this from a simple point of view, and this is actually surprisingly subtle, and I don't know if Eastman and Lair intended this, but it seems on the surface like this is just your typical chain of violence. Like, one person is killed and another person retaliates, and so on and so forth, and it goes on forever. And in a sense, this is how the feud between the Turtles and the Foot Clan started, over this, going back to the dispute between Nagi and Yoshi over Shen. Now, the thing about this is, looking at it from each standpoint, it's a lot more complicated than you realize. And there is something that actually puts Splinter and the Turtles over Shredder, and by extension Nagi, when it comes to morality in this case. Now, Nagi's obviously not up for debate because he tried to beat a woman for not being with him. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. So, Yoshi killed Nagi. He beat him to death. His fists were covered in his blood. Now, obviously, he killed Nagi defending the woman he loved. That is not a crime. I mean, killing a man is, but that's special circumstances, right? Now, the thing is, debatably, Yoshi could have held back and not killed Nagi. He could have, left him alive, or just not gone so far as beating him severely as he did. But he did do that. That's what happened. We can't ignore that. Then we move to the second case with Shredder, Saki going and killing Shen and Yoshi in New York. This is where things get interesting. Shredder breaks into their apartment, kills Shen, and then waits for Yoshi in their home. Now, once Yoshi shows up, sees his wife dead, Shredder tells him who he is, and then kills him. Now, obviously, Yoshi would have fought back, but considering at this point, like Shredder's already in his armor, he's covered in blades, he's also younger, and this is the one time where there's like an age gap between Yoshi and Saki. And so at the very least, Saki's at least a decade younger than Yoshi, so that also gives him a little bit of an advantage. So in all cases, Yoshi's chances were really slim. Like, he'd have to have gotten really lucky, maybe if he had a weapon, which it doesn't seem like he did, but regardless, Yoshi is killed. And then, 15 years later, after being mutated and training 4 turtles to carry out this mission, Splinter sends said turtles to kill Shredder. And it seems like this is just a clear-cut case of one thing leading to the other, yada, 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 and nobody is better than the other in this case, if you look at it. And there's a clear case when it comes to the fight later between the Turtles and Shredder that I will also point out. But when you get down to the crux of it, it's not. And in fact, there are some subtle things here that actually put the Turtles and Splinter over Shredder. And it's this. So, with the killing of Nagi, you can debate whether it's murder. That's up for debate. What happened with Yoshi and Shen, though, is not. Because even discounting the exact circumstances, what puts it over on the Turtles and Splinter's favor, in this case, morally speaking, is the fact that Saki kills Shen. Let me repeat that. Saki kills Shen, the woman whose only part in this was being the person of affection for both his brother and his brother's rival. And then being a person who his brother actually beat up. Something that we know for a fact Splinter was there to actually witness. So, without debate, we can say that Nagi actually beat up Shen. Which you should never... People always say you shouldn't beat up... You shouldn't hit women. You shouldn't hit anybody. You shouldn't hit women, obviously, but you shouldn't hit anybody. So, another person, certainly not a man, beating up a woman who... It's pretty... I mean, I'd be willing to say that Shen probably doesn't know any martial arts. That's kind of... At least that's what that feels like this is implying. But regardless, the point is... Nagi beat up Shen, and then... Over a decade later, this guy, this idiot who was in love with her, who couldn't stand not having her, she's killed by this idiot's brother, who for some reason, like Shen, you have to assume that in Saki's mind, Shen is partially, if not wholly, responsible for all of this. From, inducing the rivalry between Nagi and Yoshi, to, being the catalyst for Yoshi killing Nagi. But the fact of the matter is, she was wholly innocent in this. Really. From a moral standpoint, she basically had nothing to do with this. If you want to say she was the cause of things, that's kind of a shitty way of looking at it. But she was an innocent victim, and she was the first one, that the Shredder killed. And what's worse is, what really puts this over the edge in the Turtles and Splinter's favor is that the Shredder broke into their home, killed Shen, waited for Yoshi, and then killed him. He broke in and murdered this woman, and if the Shredder had shown up and came in and challenged Yoshi over Nagi's death, that would be a different story. That would be like, it would still be a crime because obviously that sort of thing is kind of illegal. That wouldn't be, I don't like, that wouldn't exactly fly here and probably not in Japan either. So obviously it's illegal, and obviously Nagi, Nagi, his case being murder, like I said, is debatable. But with Shen, if the Shredder had challenged Yoshi properly, this wouldn't be like, it wouldn't be like, Splinter really wouldn't have a leg to stand on. But he does because of the way Saki went about things. And what really puts it in their favor even more is that Splinter actually sends a formal challenge to the Shredder to avenge Shen and Yoshi. He actually, not only does he call out Shredder on his honor, but he does it in a formal manner, telling him the challenge. And going forward, the Shredder proves himself to be even more immoral, and once again shows that Splinter, and by extension the Turtles, are justified in going after him. And I will get to that, but my point is that when you look at it, even though it seems like a very clear-cut case of just violence begets violence, it's not. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. And that's what's surprisingly interesting here, because when I went into this, I kind of always thought of it as being just that. Violence begets violence. But it's actually a lot more complicated. It's a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more layered. Because at every stage of the game, the Turtles and Splinter, even with their intentions to kill Shredder, act more honorable than Shredder. And that is amazing and kind of subtle, because I don't think I've ever seen anybody talk about this. Most people kind of just say it's like one, it's just more violent, but it's surprisingly nuanced, and that I kind of love that. That's something I noticed just because I was going to make this video. I went over this, I analyzed it, and I actually found this to be the case, and I love that. That's amazing. So yeah, let's move on, shall we? Because I kind of ended up talking about this one note way longer than I intended to. So let's go. So let's see. The next note is so we get a little bit more characterization for Raphael. Like I said, he's almost the only one who really gets any sort of characterization in this book. But Raph is like the one who Splinter sent to deliver the message to Shredder. And Raph genuinely loves being above ground. He loves being able to move, being able to go where he wants. Being, he literally says he despises the dank, dark underground. But the point is, Raph really likes being above ground. He likes being out in the open. And it kind of shows the layers of his character that I think that's, even though he doesn't come off quite as angry, even though he does enjoy the violence, he enjoys the fighting more than, say, the other Turtles. At least that's what's implied early on in the comic. But the fact that he is prefers to be above ground compared to below it, it's interesting to me, and it makes me think that might be why he's so angry going forward. It's that, and there are other things that are going to make him angry going forward as well, but I think the idea that the main reason he's so pissed off all the time is that they have to hide and have to, not show themselves to the rest of the world. I like that. That's an interesting idea. At least that's what I get out of that scene. It's such a minor thing, really, when you get down to it, but it is a bit of characterization, and it implies, at least to me, so much. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, that the reason Raph is as angry as he is, outside of just a natural lust for battle, is that he can't stand that they have to hide, that they have to treat themselves differently than everybody else, because in the end, the Turtles and Splinter are people. They have personalities, they are intelligent, sentient, sapient beings, and they have to hide like monsters in the sewers because they would not be understood by the outside world. And that's tragic, honestly, when you get down to that part of their lives. It is a sad truth. And if they didn't find themselves constantly battling evil on behalf of everybody else that don't even know they exist, well, who knows what they would have done with their lives, past this point. I mean, really, and we'll get into that once we get to issue 2, because I got some things I already know about with that issue that I want to say that it relates directly to this. But moving on once again to the next thing, we then get this bit because, I want to point this out too. Why did Splinter, because Raph literally, like, again, everybody's narrating to themselves. Shredder, Leo, Raph. I mean, the only ones who don't really are Donnie and Mikey, and maybe Splinter, because Splinter kind of narrated the whole thing when he was telling the backstory to the Turtles, but that's debatable if that's like, because he's like telling them a story, whereas like Raph, Leo, and the Shredder all get, you know, some sort of inner monologue bits, like where we hear their thoughts. We really never get that with Donnie or Mikey. And now I just feel bad for Donnie and Mikey. Like, they need some more stuff, too. Can we get some more screen time for them, you know? That would be nice. All I'm saying, you know? And I think that's, now that I think about it, that's kind of a problem that's continued going forward. I mean, we've gotten a little better, but honestly, the focus is all too often on Raph and Leo. Could we get some more love for the purple and orange brothers, please? But anyway, why is Raph... Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, why is Raph the one chosen by Splinter to deliver the message to Shredder? Why is Raph the one who is sent to deliver this message? And I'm going to be honest, I don't really have a good reason. The only explanation I can really think of is that Splinter knows that Raph is so competent combat-wise and so competent stealth-wise that he's the best choice for this. And I can kind of see that, because assuming that Raph is just a little bit better at stealth than, say, his other 3 brothers, which sounds ludicrous because Leo is always shown as being the best, but, you know, it's not a straight-up thing. Like, my mindset has always been that Raph is like the tank of the group. He's the most physically capable of taking out people. And, you know, Leo is a close second, where he relies purely on skill and less on strength, unlike Raph, who goes in guns blazing, so to speak. Mikey is like, sort of like, has the most potential, but is kind of lazy and therefore relies on raw talent too much, but is still good enough to keep up with the rest of his brothers. And then you have Donnie, who I've always thought, like, while he's like physically fit and he's well trained and he does focus on his abilities, maybe focuses a little bit too much on his intellectual pursuits as well, and thus neglects his skills, his ninja skills, a little bit too much from time to time. That's just my perception on things, but I don't know. So maybe in this case, when it comes to stealth, like, you know, Raph just nudged out Leo just enough to be sent on this particular mission. But that's my best guess, because, like, I can't think of an otherwise good reason why. I mean, sending one person to just deliver a message makes sense, even though Raph could have probably done it without fighting anybody, because that's coming up as well. But all things considered, you know, sending one person to do the job does make sense, at least to me anyway. I mean, I don't think you need to send 3 people just to deliver a message. 4 people. I think I meant to say 3 other people, but you get my point. Like, it makes sense to send one person. I'm just curious why it's Raph specifically. But anyway, moving on from that, we then get, like, this one drawing, which to me, does this make anybody else think of, like, a video game choice, like one of those times where you like decide, okay,
going this way you will have to deal with 1 guard, but going this way you have to deal with 2. Now if you go after the 1 guard, this 1 guard is particularly skilled and far more self-aware than most guards. But if you go after the 2 guards, you have to deal with them, and they are also very skilled and are much more dangerous together than apart. Yada yada yada. Which choice will you choose? Yeah, you know,
whatever, blah, blah, blah. You know, whenever you're given like a choice to go one way or the other. That's what this reminds me of. And I don't know. That's what this. I just wanted to comment on that because that's what came into my mind when I just looked at this panel. But anyway, and I pointed this out earlier, like how Mikey and Donnie don't get enough attention in the franchise as a whole, and that. You know, they really haven't, they don't get any, there's no inner monologues for them, unlike Leo or the Shredder or Raph even. But what's funny about that is, I wrote this down because of it, Mikey gets very little dialogue. I think he talks twice in this entire comic. Once, he was the first one to address Master Splinter once they get back to the lair at the beginning of the book after beating up the purple dragons. and then one line at the very end, and that's it. I don't think Mikey talks more than twice. When I think about it, I think Donnie, if you count like any of the time that the turtles, like for like say like that bit from the flashback where they're all talking, all four of the turtles are talking, and we each get a little one word from them each, or like two words from them each, with the Star Trek, pizza, Moto Guzzi, whatever. Okay, one of them is definitely Donnie. Donnie, I don't think gets any dialogue. So like I said, like there's they got almost nothing going on here. Outside of the idea that one of them had to build the gate, and in hindsight it's gotta be Donnie, like, you know, the entrance to Lair, it's like they got nothing. It's like they have like you know, it's funny. Like, the one time Donnie actually talks in this book, like, straight up where you can tell it's him, because the only time you could really tell the turtles apart is when they have their weapons. That's the weird thing about it. Like, the turtles almost always, you know, like if any given panel, if you don't see their weapon, because it's black and white, and because each of them is wearing a red bandana in this continuity, even though it's black and white, you cannot tell which one it is unless you see their weapons. So the one time we are sure that Donnie's the one talking is in an instance where him and like Raph, Donnie and Leo. So, like, Mikey gets 2 lines, and Donnie gets 1 line that's shared with Leo and Raph, where literally it's like the 3 of them, and they said, they're good, we are better. And it's like they each, like Raph, Donnie, and Leo each say a part of the line, and that's cool and all, and I like that, but it's weird because Donnie basically doesn't, I don't think he says something, like there's a part at the very end of the comic where he says something, and I'm like, or he could be one of the people saying something, because it's, again, hard to tell, because you can't see their weapons. It's one of those things where this first issue where, because you're not 100% sure, like, because it's never because you don't always see their weapons, and it doesn't always seem like they are carrying their weapons, so it's not always clear who's who, and that's kind of a detriment to the comic overall. But regardless, let's keep going. Let's see, and then, like, this is just something me pointing out the different, like, manners of Japanese culture that Eastman and Laird managed to actually slip into the book. Like, when the turtles first crawl up the building to fight the Shredder, they used something called shuko claws, like a set of metal claws that are wrapped around the palm to, like, stick into the wall and crawl, kind of like Spider-Man almost. But, you know, this is an actual ninja tool that is used. It has been historically known to be used by the ninja, and as you can actually buy them in real life, because for some reason we now know all of the equipment used by ninjas, and if you want to buy them, you can just buy them on the internet. I swear, if ninjas still exist, then their being so ubiquitous in pop culture is just another ploy to make us all think that they don't actually still exist. You know what I mean? Do I make sense? And now a ninja's probably going to come try and take me out because I said this on the internet, but whatever. Point is, they use some shuko climbing claws, and then later you see the turtles actually using shuriken. I like that because it's cool, like it's one, actual ninja-related stuff that we see from the turtles, but 2, it's actually cool to see them use something besides their standard weapons. You know, the sais, the bow staff, the nunchaku, the maybe katanas, maybe ninjaken swords, whatever. The point is, it's kind of cool to actually see them use something besides just their standard weapon. So they use the shuko climbing claws, and then they use shuriken against the Shredder later, and it's cool to actually see that. And you can also see, like, there are other instances where, like, you know, at the end, after they beat the Shredder, they offer him, showing that they are, once again, more honorable than him, they offer him the chance to commit seppuku. He refuses, of course, but they do offer him, having beat him in this honorable challenge, that what they did, like, properly give him the challenge, and he accepted. They won. They offer him the chance to commit seppuku and regain his honor, and he refuses like a dick, and then tries to kill not just like himself but all of them. Fails, of course, because he's a dick. And I'm sorry, I just can't help it. Also, I like this. This is a minor one. Like I said, a little bit of Japanese stuff in there. And I don't know where Eastman and Laird, because the internet didn't exist in 1984. Where did they get this? Did they just happen to have a book about Japanese yokai and mystical creatures? Because at one point the Shredder calls the turtle Kappa. And I'm like, That's really interesting because this isn't even the first time it is the first time, but it isn't the last time this particular comparison between the turtles and Kappa are made. And for those who don't know, and I'll show you a picture of what a Kappa is traditionally meant to look like, it does look like kind of like a big turtle. It's a little different, obviously. Like the turtles don't have bowls on their heads that contain water. They also don't have hair. But generally speaking, you could say to a person who is familiar with the Kappa myth and legend, you could say the turtles do vaguely resemble Kappa. So I like that comparison, and I like that it's made in this very first issue of the series, like the franchise ever. The point is, I just like that. It's such a minor detail, but I really appreciate that that's a thing, and that the Shredder calls them that, because it's something that most people who read this when this came out would not know what a freaking Kappa is, but apparently Eastman and Lair did enough research to use Kappa and Seppuku and Shuka climbing claws. I assume some of them at least knew what shuriken were, even if they didn't know that they were called shuriken. I think most people called them ninja stars at that point. But the point I'm trying to make is Eastman and Laird actually did some research when it came to ninjas and Japanese culture and mythos in general to include something like this, and I really appreciate that. It's such a minor detail, but I think it's cool. You know what I mean? Yeah, you know what I mean. After they've beaten all, because the Shredder, again, showing how morally bankrupt he is compared to the Turtles who actually challenged him to this fight, the Shredder came and brought his men with him, which you might call maybe he's just evening the odds. No, the Shredder is a master. The Turtles are students. So, which I will take some credit away from Splinter for sending his students and his adopted sons out to fight on his behalf when they're just students. But to be fair, there's 4 of them and 1 Shredder. But of course, Shredder is dishonorable and brings a bunch of his men. And while the Turtles are proven superior, even though there are way more dudes than them, and they take those guys out, they win. They prove themselves superior, and then they face the Shredder, who is fresh, has not been in the fight so far. He waited for his guys to lose before entering this fight, which again shows how dishonorable the Shredder is. He comes in, he fights them, and he shows that and Leo even makes this observation. They need to go in and use team tactics and team tactics and long distance tactics, which is where the shuriken I mentioned earlier come in. They use those to fight him at a distance. They go in one at a time, hit him hard, and then move for the other person to come in, or go in maybe 2 at a time. So they're going after him tactically, using their skills and strategy to take him out. Instead, and there's a point here where Raph actually mockingly calls the Shredder master, and it's clearly in a mocking tone. You can tell it's very well presented that way, where it's because the Shredder had pointed out that it was students against students when the Turtles were fighting the Shredder's men. But now it's he is a master and they are just students, but they are so Raph is mocking him for that. But anyway, yeah. And then Donnie coming in clutch actually hits the Shredder from behind and then hits him in the face so hard he actually breaks the mask portion of the helmet. At the end of the first movie where the Shredder willingly takes off the bottom part of his helmet to expose his face and the scars that Splinter gave him in that continuity, which I kind of wish was used more often because I always liked that part. Well, in this comic, Donnie actually hits the Shredder so hard that the mask part comes off, and it's just the helmet that he's wearing, and it's honestly pretty dope from Donnie, who I mentioned before doesn't get much in this first issue. So him coming in and doing that is kind of dope, and which gives him a little bit and this is not the last time this happens either. So of course Shredder comes in and retaliates hard, and so Donnie is gets hit hard and is thrown away. But Leo comes in hits him where he blocks him with one blade, and then literally this is by far the most violent and brutal thing in this first issue. Well, okay, maybe the second, considering how things go after this, but the point is, Leo full-on stabs the Shredder. Look at this panel. Look at it. That sword is coming right through. Like, I don't know if Leo deliberately hit him in such a way where it wouldn't go through any vital organs, but if the Shredder had gotten medical attention, he would have lived. He could have lived, because he clearly, like, continues acting like he's not that wounded, but honestly, if he hadn't, he would have bled out. He would have, like, just bled out from that wound, because it goes through. Like, that sword is, like, I mean, it's pretty big. I mean, Leo's a small guy, like I mentioned earlier. He's, like, probably at most, like, a little bit less than 5 foot, but that sword is decently sized for his body, and it just goes right through the Shredder, like, just all the way through. Like, look at him, man. That is brutal. Genuinely brutal. I kind of love how stupidly brutal that is. Is it weird that I like that so much? It probably is. But point is, it's cool. And then, of course, like, you know, that's when, like, they offer to let him commit seppuku. And the Shredder just refuses like a dick and brings out, of all things, I don't know where he was hiding this. He's a ninja, whatever, but he pulls out a fucking thermite grenade and is like, you know what? I, the Shredder, will not die here alone. Hey, if I have to go, I'm taking you with me. And so he like activates the grenade and like freaking is just about to blow him and the turtles. So once again, showing that again, in the end, the turtles and Splinter are more honorable than the Shredder. I keep emphasizing this because after the argument about all the deaths and their intent to come and kill him, in the end, they offered him the chance to take his own life. And in the end, they gave him the opportunity because, once again, Donnie comes in clutch and is, you might think, like, he's the one who actually kills the Shredder, because what happens is Donnie, like, throws his bow staff like a freaking javelin, and it hits the Shredder in the face, him and the grenade go off the freaking roof. And I want to point out, thermite, it's specifically a thermite grenade. Thermite is like a substance that when heated will get hot, like really hot, like it will melt metal hot. So Donnie hits the Shredder, who falls off a building, and otherwise he seems to be a normal human, so he probably would have died if he'd hit the ground anyway. But so like the Shredder's falling off the roof with the grenade, so he explodes before even hitting the ground. Like, first of all, that's a brutal way to go. Like I said, I thought about it as I was talking, and I was about to say that him getting stabbed was the most brutal thing in this book. But no, you know what? No. Like, him getting knocked off of a building after getting stabbed and then being blown up, that's the most brutal thing in this book. 100%. Most brutal thing by far. Also, Johnny, you know what? Forget Johnny, because you know what? Or forget Mikey, because Mikey's the one who gets the least in this book. He talks twice and then that's it. And his second line is literally coming up at the end of the book here. But he literally, like, because he gets almost nothing in this book, but freaking Raph and Leo at least get, like, to narrate a bit. We get a little bit of characterization for Raph, and he gets to go on a mission by himself. Donnie is the one who actually kills the Shredder, like, full on kills the Shredder. You know what? So, Donnie, Donatello, you are the man, okay? The turtle in purple, the guy who does machines, he is officially... Donnie just moved up a couple of ranks for this, like, because he came in clutch. He came in clutch more than once, and then at the end, he's the one who did it. He's the one who took out the Shredder. Props, just all the props there. Like, all right, Donnie is officially, you know what? He might be my second favorite turtle now. I don't know. I don't even know. I'll have to think about it. Either way, this is cool. Am I going too long? I think yeah. Okay. Point is, Donnie did some good work here today. But anyway, yeah, so they're done. They kind of go downstairs, and then I mentioned, like I said, like Mikey's second line is coming up here, and here it is. Literally him saying he's tired to Leonardo, like, what the heck? Come on, man. You got to do, I know that this was, it was meant to be a one-shot, so if we ever did, this would have been all we would have heard from Mikey the whole time. That and the one line from the beginning where he's the one who first talks to, like, Splinter when they get back to the lair, and it's like, okay, like, Like, that's all we get from Mikey. That's just weird to think about. If this book hadn't been a success, an unexpected success, and this became a franchise, we would have gotten nothing else from, at least, Leo, we would have gotten to know a little bit. Raph, we would have gotten to know a little bit more because he got the realist, characterization. And like I said, Donnie killed the Shredder. Mikey got more or less nothing in this first issue, just nothing, and that's genuinely makes me a little bit sad. I'm so glad this series is ongoing, and I'm going to make this into an ongoing series on the channel because gosh darn it, we need to give some more love to my man Michelangelo. Because he just got nothing in this first issue, which is one of the few issues with this book. But anyway, the last thing I want to point out is Leo's line before he ends it with some more narration, but he has a line where he picks up, they find a piece of Shredder's armor because Shredder is blown up. So there's a little bit of him there, and a little bit of him there, and all over the place. So, Leo finds a piece of the Shredder's armor, like one of his gauntlets, and it's like, it seems that the Shredder has been shredded. That might actually, I'm so glad it doesn't end on that and we get a little bit more narration, because my God, that might actually be the worst line in this entire comic. I know that's saying something because this was written in the 80s and the two guys who wrote this were, very inexperienced and amateurs and they didn't entirely know what they were doing, and it was meant to be a parody anyway. But that is still might actually be the dumbest action hero line. Like Leo's channeling his inner Schwarzenegger. That's the best way I can put it, because that is such a dumb line. I love it, but it's still a stupid line. It's a really stupid line. But anyway, let's move on to my final thoughts, shall we? So, let's wrap this up, shall we? Because frankly speaking, I think I've been talking for something like 2 hours now, and this is going to be a pain to edit. That's all I'm going to say there, because, oh God, help me. But anyway, this was interesting, to say the least. Going back and reading this, there was some stuff there I noticed that I don't think I noticed the first time I read this comic, which was a while ago, but, I genuinely really enjoyed this. Now, that's not to say there aren't any problems. Like I said, Eastman and Laird, as much as I love the guys, as much as I love them for creating this franchise, and for me, it's Turtles is number 3. There's One Piece, Ruby, and then Ninja Turtles, and those are my 3 top favorite series of all time. And Turtles is probably the biggest of the 3, at least when it comes to name recognition and the fact that there have been multiple versions of the characters. But regardless, the thing about the Turtles is that, with this first issue, Eastman and Laird were amateurs. The artwork isn't bad, but it's clear, that they were only just getting into this. They were only really just learning their craft, and as such, it's a little, off. It's especially when they're doing atmospheric shots or action stuff or drawing the Turtles and Splinter, they're fine. It's whenever they're drawing any humans where it really shows to me. I feel like you can always tell how good a person's art style is by how they draw their people. It's not, because you can have a very cartoonish art style and still tell that a person is a very skilled artist. When it comes to drawing people, though, at least at this stage, Eastman and Lair were a little bit and it's I can't blame them for that. Drawing people, as an artist myself, I can tell you right now, drawing people, I could draw you a monster and it will look gorgeous, at least in my opinion. I think that's where, I could draw you a landscape. I could draw you a weird, really, up for interpretation kind of mosaic thing that's kind of weird and abstract. But when it comes to drawing people, people are hard to get right, because we have a lot of, when it comes to drawing people, it's just a pain. That's all I'll say. But point is, so the art's a little wonky. The dialogue isn't terrible, actually, but it's not great either. The dialogue is just okay. There's some cliches in there, but to be fair, this was meant to be a parody. And being a parody, it kind of lends itself more to that stuff, so that's fine. The fact that Mikey gets almost nothing and that the only thing that really salvages Donnie is that he's the one who gets to kill the Shredder is probably that's it. But otherwise, there is not much there's not much going on there that really that saves those two. Raph gets the most characterization and the most focus, weirdly enough. We get a little bit from Leo, but I do mean a little bit, so really there's not much otherwise. So it's not terrible. Splinter, as you get the idea that he's meant to be this stereotypical wise mentor figure who taught the turtles, who raised them, who taught them how to fight. But it's like, again, Splinter, you get that idea, but there isn't much to his character otherwise. Shredder is an interesting case. He started, because you get the idea that he was just this kid who wanted to avenge his brother and slowly became much more and more of a not good person, where he started doing more criminal acts and became more morally bankrupt as he went along. And it becomes interesting by that end. And like I said, the moral thing with the characters and the whole chain of violence and the fact that the turtles are actually have a higher moral standing than Shredder, when you look at it more closely, that definitely enhanced it for me. But when you get down to the crux of it, this book, as good as it is it's kind of I think the real reason why this became a franchise and why this series became as big as it did was because of the premise. Because it obviously the whole ninjas thing was good. It definitely this is definitely one of the series that made ninjas a household name. But when you look at it, I think the thing that really sold it is the premise that you have these 4 mutant turtles who are ninjas. And, you've got a title that, it just stands out because it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That just pops. That brings your eye to a cover page when you got it in that big, bold, boxy font that they used for the original comics. So it works. But I think it really is just that premise. Again, they're mutants, they're ninjas, they're turtles, and as such, you get this weird thing where you're okay, well, what is going on here? And then you find out that they're these badass kind of ninja warriors who are going out to avenge their master's master, and it's a little cliche, but between those cliches are done well enough where combine it with the unique premise, and you've got this weird cauldron of ideas that sort of mixed, that became this worthwhile, series, and eventually this huge franchise that is going to this very day. So in the end, it was really kind of a stroke of luck that, Eastman and Lair came up with this and do. And I think they know this, and I think everybody knows this based on how often this story is told. So, and I'm just happy to have had this because it's it really is amazing to go back and look at it where this franchise started. Because it's, like I said, my third favorite thing there is, and I'm going to have so much fun going over these comics with you guys. But it's honestly just one of my favorite things in the world, and I had a really fun time talking about this, though, like I said, editing this is going to be horrendous. So let me just wrap this up. So with my new system that I'm going to be doing with these different series going forward, everything that I am going to talk about is going to be ranked because this is sort of a analysis / review / whatever. So overall, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1, otherwise known as Eastman and Laird's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, is it's pretty good. It's not perfect, but I think it's honestly everything that it is. It's pulled up by the sum of its parts. It's more than what it seems to be, like a ninja, essentially. And as such, I will give this a score of 8.2 out of 10, and I think that's a fair rating for this particular issue. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly did. I hope you'll come and listen to me talk about this stuff. Hopefully the next time I review one of these comics, it's not going to take me this long to talk about it. Maybe I won't have that many notes, but we'll see. We'll see. Anyway, this is Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus. And like I said, if you would please come and visit me again in the future, that would be an absolute delight. Thank you. Have a good day. And please, you never know. Maybe check your sewer grates every once in a while, because you never know. You might see something you just don't expect.